Good morning, it's Jeffrey Christian of CPM Group. It's about 9:30 on Friday, the 18th of February. I wanted to talk today about Russia and the world and the implications for gold. I'll talk a little bit about gold and silver toward the end of all of this. But I have a few points to talk about. We've found a lot of clients and others asking us over the last week or two, why is it that Russia and Vladimir Putin have amassed these troops on the border of the Ukraine? What is it about now and the Ukraine that has made this a global issue that has had a big impact on gold and platinum and palladium, and brought the world basically to the focus? And I will say this right off the bat. One of the reasons I think he's doing this is I think he needed some attention. We've often seen this in the case, especially like, for example, with North Korea, when the United States is paying attention to other perceived hostile actors, such as China. North Korea will lob a few missiles out as tests in order to get some attention. And, while Russia is much larger than North Korea, part of it is that we've been focusing on the South China Sea and the Straits of Taiwan. So I wanted to talk about this. And before, or as a start, I'm going to show you a table. I used it in a video last year. I used it in a speech that the PDAC asked me to give in 2018 called Russian and Chinese Global Perspectives. What are their worldviews and why do they have them? And it actually goes back to a speech that I gave to the LME around 2010, if I recall. And it's a table of global GDP in three periods: 2008, because I did the work in 2010, 2030 using World Bank projections, and 1820. And I've made the point before, if you look at 1820, China was a third of the global GDP. India was 16%. The two countries combined had half of global GDP. The United States was like number 10 or something at 1.8. We were just starting to emerge as an economic power. We were 40 years old at the time. The next three largest after China and India were France at 5.5, Russia at 5.4, and the UK at 5.2. Those were the global powers outside of Asia that you saw. And Russia saw itself as between Asia, China on the one side, and Europe. It was a little bit upset. And if you look at the history of US-Russian relations, the hostile views of Russia toward the United States and the United States toward Russia actually predates the United States. It was during the colonial period where there were economic rivalries in the North Pacific. There was an economic rivalry as to who would have an allegiance with the king of Hawaii, who would be allowed to trade in Korea, Japan, China. Whaling in the North Pacific. All of this actually predated the United States and created a centuries-old animosity. But if you look at it, Russia was basically the fourth largest economy in the world. Fast forward to 2008, and Russian share of world GDP had fallen to 1.9%. It had diminished greatly in power through 80 years of communism. They worked really hard to get that there, but they did it. After communism fell, they started to try to rebuild the country. Had a lot of problems from 1991 until 2001. We've had a lot of problems since 2001 too. Projections are that, and it's funny because in 2010 they were projecting Chinese GDP would be 15.5% of world GDP by 2030. And I think it's about 18 or 19% now. So it's going to be much larger by 2030 than the powers that be that did this arithmetic and projections thought back in 2010. But Russia was projected to be at 2.4. And that's kind of like saying, gee, guys, you're just not going to recover. I mean, you don't really have a lot of growth prospects. You have a structural system, an economic system, a political system that's probably not going to let 1,000 flowers bloom the way China and parts of Europe and the United States and Canada are going to happen. And that's very important because, Russia has a political culture, and you don't want to be too much in stereotypes. And a lot of what I'm about to say about Russia actually is true about the United States and other countries too. But Russia has a very strong national identity, and it's rooted in a historical place in the world. And a lot of it goes back to, hey, 200 years ago, we were rivals to France and the UK in terms of GDP and our place in the world. And we're not there anymore. There's also a strong cultural identity, which is defined in part by Russian ethnic traditions, which are more Slavic traditions, and they kind of smudge Russia and Slav together. So if you're Slavic, hey, aren't you kind of Russian in their mind? And it's partly by differentiation of the Slavic culture and traditions to Western European culture and traditions. And that cultural identity is also bound up in the traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there's been a state of siege mentality going back to the Tsarist eras, and there's a suspicion of outsiders. So they've always sort of wanted to be out there and to be different. So there is that issue there. Now, a lot of what you have to think about is Russia, but an even larger part is Vladimir Putin. And what are his thoughts? He was a KGB agent in Germany. He came back and he was the mayor of Leningrad. His view, which is, it's a common view within Russia, is that the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was really instrumental and probably the primary factor that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. I know folks at the Hoover Institute like to say that it was Reagan's military buildup, but it wasn't. What really it was the debacle of invading and occupying Afghanistan. And that brought home soldiers in body bags, brought home a lot of soldiers addicted to opium and heroin, and sucked a lot of economic power out of the Soviet Union. They invaded in 1979. They came out in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. And Putin's view is that they should have bombed the heck out of Afghanistan. They should have been much more ruthless. They would have pacified it, and it wouldn't have led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of its ring of satellites that it had occupied in Eastern Europe. His rise to power came when Boris Yeltsin said, we have these Chechen rebels causing problems way down in the southern part of Russia. You've got Georgia, and then Chechnya is just north of Georgia, along with a variety of other, what they call Islamic republics, Dagestan, Ossetia. And the Chechens and the Dagestan Islamic groups, there were a lot of rebels, and they were blowing up apartment buildings in Moscow and doing other things. And Yeltsin said to Putin, can you handle this problem? And he did. He bombed the heck out of Chechnya. Some estimates are that 20,000 civilians were killed. Other, probably more credible estimates are that 100,000 civilians were killed. He was extremely brutal. And he did a deal to restore order with a warlord who still runs Chechnya and still kills people randomly because he doesn't like them. And that's Putin's view of the way the world goes. And when you start thinking about Ukraine, you have to think about what he thought about Afghanistan and what he thought about Chechnya. Now, the Ukrainians are Slavs, and they're more traditionally part of what the Russians see as Greater Russia, the Slavic enterprise. They were part of the Pale of settlements that Russia had for about 200 years under Tsarist Russia. So there may be some greater humanity there, but Putin has shown that the idea of killing a few 100,000 people for political gains is not necessarily out of his realm of what's okay. He came to power because of his ability to restore order to Chechnya, and he had this vision of restoring the Russian Empire. And if you look at this map, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all were republics under the Soviet Union. They're all NATO members now. Poland, all of these other countries that are highlighted here, these were all satellites occupied by Soviet troops after World War II and kept as communist satellites until the dissolution of that bloc in 1989. They're all NATO members now, right? Moldova is still a pro-Russian republic. Ukraine is not particularly proud, never really been thrilled with Russia, has a long history of it there. The ability to restore Russian pride, Russia's place in the world, the Russian Empire, has not gone well. And now he's 69 years old. He turned 70 in October. He's facing 2 years of revolution and protests, anti-government protests in Belarus. And he's also facing problems in Kazakhstan. He sent in troops to Belarus to help try to prop up the government there because it's so undemocratic and unpopular. He sent in, and that has been festering for a couple of years. He sent in troops into Kazakhstan in December to quell a very violent anti-government insurrection that threatened to overthrow. In addition to that, you've got a US-run airbase in Kyrgyzstan. You've had US troops in Uzbekistan and other Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. They were helping us move troops and materiel into Afghanistan. NATO is throughout its former groups. You've got the US government talking to Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan about the potential of putting more US military assets in those countries. So you look at the world from Russia's perspective, and they're kind of surrounded. And the Ukraine sticks way out in there. And the Ukraine actually would like to be part of NATO. And this is perhaps the right time in his mind for doing that. Partly because Russia's foreign exchange reserves have been rebuilt. You could see back here in the early 90s, they had about $17, $18 billion of foreign exchange reserves. Oil actually got down to about $10 a barrel, and oil represents the oil and natural gas. Natural gas got down to $1.86 million BTUs. They're the major source of exports and major source of foreign exchange. Russia didn't have a lot of money. It had, by the way, watched in the post-Soviet era, a lot of the gold that seemed to have been held by the Soviet government disappear. And in 1996, 1997, the Ministry of Finance and other parts of the Russian government looked into it. Certain people went to prison, and there was a desire to rebuild the Russian patriarchy of precious metals, not just gold, but also platinum, palladium, rhodium, and diamonds that had been sold off in the chaos and disorganization of the post-Soviet Russia. You had a country that had a nominal GDP of negative 10%, but when you went around the country and you looked at independent economic activity, the estimates were that it was probably growing at a 10% rate. but no one was paying taxes. And they were stealing corporations through rigged bids, et cetera, et cetera. And Putin came in and said, we want to restore order at the time when the oil price was $10, $15 a barrel. Oil prices rose, order came, people started paying their taxes, the country's coffers started rising. And by 2007, 8, 9, they got to a pretty good level. The financial crisis hit it, started to rebuild. Other problems hit it and started to rebuild. And right now, Russia has also rebuilt its military. It has built up its financial strength and it's built up its military strength at great costs. It has some incredible new military technology that it has been hanging in front of the world's faces. And the perception is that this is the time for Russia to flex its muscles. First off, Putin is facing increased opposition within Russia. He is losing satellites and risking losing other satellites like Belarus and Kazakhstan. This is the military and financial peak, perhaps. And this may be the time to do it. This may be the last time to try to meet Putin's vision of restoring the Russian Empire and having some successes. So I think all of that comes together with a perception of a weaker, distracted the United States. We've been going on and on and on about China as our great threat, and a less unity in the NATO, both because there's less unity within the broader European intergovernmental relations, and also because of the budgets. And Mr. Trump kept saying, hey, you guys have to increase your payments to NATO or we'll just pull out US troops from Europe. So there's less unity in NATO. The US was distracted, and this may well be the military and financial peak of Russia. So if you're going to get tough, this is the time to get tough. And that's why he's there. That's about what I have to talk about why Russia may have amassed these troops on the border. Now, there are three scenarios going forward, and what do they mean for gold? The first scenario, which we put greater than 50% chances, is that Russia invades, at least to a small extent. I should point out that, everyone knows it's occupied, or it has surrogates occupying a portion of eastern Ukraine. It has occupied the Crimea, taken it over from the Ukraine. But down here in Georgia, it has occupied Abkhazia, which is just north of what used to be part of Georgia, but it's just north of what is now Georgia. It has occupied it since 2008. And South Ossetia, which is a part of Georgia right around here, it's occupied it since 2008. So he has troops here, he has troops here, he has troops here. He has a lot of weaknesses, a lot of problems domestically. And this may well be the period of time. So first scenario, they attack. Price of gold probably spikes a little bit higher and then sells off because it doesn't lead to World War III. Europe and NATO say, hey, that's bad. We're going to stop buying your oil and gas except insofar as we need it. We're going to stop buying your palladium except insofar as we need it. And he basically has pieces of it. Now, that's a problem for him because as long as they occupy parts of the Ukraine, they will have facing insurgency and what they'll call terrorism, what other people will call counterattacks. Interestingly, we have a lot of Javelin anti-tank missiles that the United States has shipped into the Ukraine, and a lot of them have gone to the border. A lot of other ones are being held back. Okay. Russians come in, they're going to come in. We're not going to stop 150,000 Russian troops with a lot of advanced armaments and missiles and planes and other things. But we will have javelins that when a tank comes down the street, wherever it is in the Ukraine, it might just get blown up. So as long as Russia's in any part of the Ukraine, it will face those problems, and that will distract it, and it will also distract financial resources, and it will drain financial resources, and it will be a problem for Russia. It will be a great benefit for some US leaders, some European leaders, for NATO, which will have a fresh breath of raison d'etre, and for military contractors in the United States and NATO countries. So that will be the status quo. Gold will come back off at some extent, because it won't lead to World War III. The second scenario is that there's some sort of diplomatic resolution and he pulls back. And if that happens, it will happen relatively suddenly, and the price of gold could come back off sharply. It's touched 1905 this morning. It broke above 1900 yesterday. It could be $1,800 within hours or days of a diplomatic solution. And the third scenario, which we probably would call number 2 in terms of probability, highest probability being some sort of invasion in the next period of time, several days, the least likely being a diplomatic solution. And the third, which number 3 in my list of scenarios, but probably number 2 in probability, is that this goes on for an extended period of time. And that will keep gold prices higher around where they are now, maybe move gold prices even higher for a longer period of time before it becomes the status quo and the gold price subsides. So that's the least, well, the most positive view for gold prices is an invasion. The least positive is the diplomatic solution. And in between is the idea that this becomes the status quo for a period of time, and people just sort of lose interest on it. A couple of words about silver, because silver has not really performed in line with gold and palladium over the last few days and the last week or so. That indicate, that's a symptom of what we've talked about in past videos, which is that you have a lot of dissatisfied investors at silver, people who were told that silver would be $50 by April of 2021, last February, and it didn't get there. And it still hasn't gotten there. And yeah, there are a lot of dissatisfied investors who have grievances against silver. It's been poorly marketed to investors. They feel they've been sold a bill of goods, and they're not moving into silver the way they're moving into gold for this. So silver seems very vulnerable. It hasn't risen sharply, and it hasn't fallen sharply. Our strategy, which I think we elucidated in our trade recommendation on silver yesterday to our clients, was that this is a good time probably for a straddle or a strangle option strategy, because A, silver could play catch up and it could break out of its range, but more likely it's vulnerable on the downside. And if you play your cards right, we might see a breakout on the upside. You buy a straddle, you might make money on your call leg, and then the price comes back off and you might make money on your put leg. That's what I had to talk about today. Next Tuesday, we have our open forum for clients. It's an online seminar, so I won't be doing a video next Tuesday, but this thing will happen at 11 a.m. next Tuesday, and we will take questions. Clients can send in questions at info@cpmgroup.com ahead of time, or they can ask questions during the forum. Our gold yearbook is under production right now, and we're doing work on our silver yearbook and platinum data, as always. You can go to our website, cpmgroup.com. There are a lot of free reads. There are past videos that you can watch. There are presentations. I think you can even find that 2018 PDAC presentation somewhere on our website, perhaps. And then you can also read about our services and our research reports that we produce. Thank you. Take care. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.